Good morning from Santiago de Chile. I'm Karen Poniachik, Director of Columbia Global Center in Santiago, and we're delighted that you could join us for this new installment of the series, The Future of Journalism, that we have organized in association with the School of Journalism at Universidad Diego Portales and the School of Journalism at Columbia University. We're delighted to host today Emily Bell, Director of the Toll Center for Investigative Journalism. Emily joined us here in Chile 2 years ago, and now we're having her via Zoom, as we all work now these days, and I'm sure she'll be covering that topic in her presentation. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Andrea from the Escuela de Periodismo de Universidad Diego Portales. Emily will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then Paula Escobar, who teaches journalism at Universidad Diego Portales, will hold a conversation with her, and you will be able to participate by sending questions through the chat room. So Emily, Emily, it's your turn. This really is yours. Thanks very much again.
Thank you so much, Karen, and good morning, everyone. Thanks very much indeed for joining us here. I'm so sorry that I'm not there in person. Coming to Santiago a couple of years ago, I travel all the time. It still remains my absolutely favorite visit. So hopefully when this is over, I can come back and see, if I'm invited back, I can come back and see you all in person. So I was just going to talk a little bit today about, I know the future of journalism is such a big topic, and I'm sure lots of people are slightly sick of hearing about it because it always seems to be bad news. The pandemic is changing, I think, some of the trends that we've been looking at for the last few years. It's accelerating a lot of things that we have seen. It is introducing some new challenges and opportunities. And I think that we will have a very different shape of our industry when we get to the other side of this. And we don't know yet what the other side means. Taking our lead from the public health people that we work with here at Columbia, doing our own modeling into it. Nobody really believes, I think, even with a vaccine, that there will be anything which is like normal before late 2022, and maybe not even until something like 2024. So that's a couple of years, and an awful lot can happen at that time. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about three things. The first thing is trends which are accelerating. So in other words, things that were happening before, but that are happening now much more quickly. The second thing is things which are new. These may have happened a little bit before, but perhaps we didn't expect them to happen so kind of completely. And then really the third thing is just very quickly to say what I think that means in the long term. We at the Town Centre are doing two major research projects, one with the ICFJ, which is global. We have about sort of 3,000 journalists from around the world that have been responding to surveys. I really wanted to share some of the data from that with you this morning, but unfortunately, with big organizations, when you're doing research, it's going to be a couple of weeks, but I will certainly send the slides and the findings, and some of what I will talk about today comes from the insight that we're getting into that early research. The second thing we're doing is we're doing a comprehensive, we hope, layoff and changes tracker at Columbia Journalism School, which we want to expand internationally. We launched it last week. It gives us a very close insight into what's happening in the US market, and we want to add regions, including Latin America. So there is data that we're getting that enables us to see some of these changes actually happening. So the first kind of thing really is about, what are the rapid changes? What is the acceleration of the changes? And the first big one, which everybody knows about, but which is really so important, is the decline of advertising as a means of supporting free media, and particularly at local level. So in other words, the gentle decline and steep declines we've seen in print advertising and online advertising in the last year has really accelerated. our anecdotal evidence is that news organizations are seeing sort of 50 to 75% of their advertising revenue lost this year. There's a global estimate of all revenues lost in the newspaper and magazine business, which came out, I think, last week from PricewaterhouseCoopers in the UK. Their global estimate is a 15% loss of revenues across everything in newspapers and magazines. But when it comes to advertising, just anecdotally, what we're hearing is it's much steeper. And it doesn't look like it's going to come back to news organizations in the same way. In other words, that loss in advertising is going principally, when it comes back, it's coming back to the big platforms, particularly Facebook and Google, and I'll talk about them in a minute. The second thing, which is accelerating, is the end of print. We've seen lots and lots of news organizations in the US, and we're hearing dozens of reports from around the world of even where print is not closing, editions are being cut. So people are going from printing 7 days a week or 5 days a week to 2 or 3 times a week, or just losing print completely. The logistics of delivering it are too hard. The growth in reader revenue for some, so this is a caveat, this is a good piece of news, but it's not good news for everybody, which is we are seeing a much greater increase in the number of people now paying for news. But from what we can tell, the number of subscriptions that people have is relatively small. So it might only be for 1 or 2 publications. Like the vast majority of subscribers have a very small number of subscriptions. And we don't know, the caveat to that is we don't know what will happen to that number when the consumer, if you like, the sort of the income recession continues. So as people see less money coming into their houses, they now have so many subscriptions that news is fighting for people's money alongside streaming services, which have grown a great deal. So we don't think of those as being part of the news universe, but they are. So that competition with streaming could be something which sort of stops subscriptions being the savior of journalism. But, you know, there's some good news there. Then I think, you know, the other trend which has really accelerated is consolidation into sort of big players, whether that's chains. So, you know, in the United States, when I got here 10 years ago, there were like a dozen sizable, maybe more than a dozen sizable local news chains. We're going from that to maybe 2 to maybe 1 in the next couple of years, which is really dramatic. I think that we've seen that those which are larger really consolidate their kind of business model. So the New York Times is hiring a lot of journalists. You see news outlets like CNN or Fox News, etc., still making a lot of money. The bigger players, it's replicating the rest of the economy. The bigger players are doing very well. The rest of the field is not doing quite so well, particularly not at local level. However, again, looking for some good things, what this is forcing, I think, is a really sort of rapid uptick in both collaboration between news organizations. So we've seen a really big investigation in financial misdealings by investment banks this week, which is done by the ICFJ, led by BuzzFeed News, but also other news partners are in that network. And actually one of the things which has happened, one of the real successes in journalism over the last 10 years has been the formulation of these networks of collaboration. And we are seeing more of those. So during the pandemic, we see local news organizations that were competing now joining together. We see radio stations now not just collaborating with, but sometimes taking over the ownership of local newspapers, which are failing, and bringing on board some of their journalists to expand the news offering. So that, I think, is good news. There is a sort of another really unfortunate acceleration in this, which is just pressure on press freedom. So we sometimes don't think about this in the same time that we're thinking about business models, but I think it's very important to note that all of this is happening against the background of governments who are everywhere becoming more aggressive towards the press, where it's becoming harder for weaker press institutions to stand up to large, powerful organizations, which is another reason that having networks is such an important part of how we will develop, because as we lose those institutional strengths, we need to find a way to fight against it. Otherwise, the actual sort of rights and press freedoms get gradually eroded. And we're seeing that very vividly at the moment in the US. And we're seeing it very concretely elsewhere in the world with changes in legislation, the imprisonment of journalists, etc. Then there's a sort of, so those are the trends that we already knew about, which are growing. The things which have happened, which I think we didn't know whether they would happen or not before the pandemic, they look likely, but which are now definitely happening. The first one is a very obvious one, which is remote working. And what is the future of the newsroom? So I think one of the big questions this has thrown up is, you know, we're all asking ourselves, when do we go back to the office? Here in New York City, most offices are still empty. The New York Times is not going back until the new year. The New York Daily News has said we are no longer going to have a newsroom in the way that we had a newsroom, which is, you know, that's an iconic landmark, if you like, in New York journalism, which has just said, I think that we can all work from home. There are a number of, I think the press organizations, excuse me, which can work remotely, have had a big advantage. And now the question, particularly when costs are involved, of when does everybody come back to the newsroom? What is the advantage of a newsroom? We're seeing those questions raised all over the place. And we don't expect, you know, when newsrooms come back, they're going to be much smaller. Partly because people will have lost journalists, but also partly because there's now going to be a move, I think, to choosing to keep people working remotely. So the end of newsrooms, I think, means that we have a big challenge to think about in terms of our technology, in terms of our reporting techniques, and in terms of how we train journalists. So, you know, without giving too much away on the embargoed research, one of the things we were asking journalists for is about their needs in the current moment. And it's clear that we have a training deficit when it comes to advanced verification techniques online. We see just that, you know, the rising tide of disinformation, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is another real factor in reporters thinking, I need to have different skills to be able to actually sort of navigate these stories these days. The second thing is that, you know, we're teaching people how to report remotely at Columbia Journalism School at the moment. You think, well, reporting remotely, it's a Zoom conversation, but not necessarily. It's also about, can you train your sources to report for you? So if you're in our video journalism class, it was always about going and filming. But now when there are inaccessible places like hospitals, or where you're going to affect the story, the key skill is to be able to train the people who are able to get access to do that reporting for you. So there's a whole range of remote reporting skills, using available communications technologies, improvisation, and just teaching journalists, again, how to store data safely, how to kind of take electronic records of things and keep them safe, which were, I would say, we would teach to, you know, investigative journalists, but if you're on the health beat, it wouldn't necessarily be something you would think about before now. Now it's absolutely imperative that we teach those skills, so that is changing, I think. I think it's also, I want to acknowledge that one of the other big changes during the pandemic, which is not surprising, but which newsrooms are not well equipped to cope with, is just the psychological pressure on individual journalists. Everybody is in the same situation. There's a lot of uncertainty about job, you know, employment uncertainty, there's financial uncertainty, and it's coupled with, but for journalists, it's coupled with a very, very high workload. So everybody has seen their workloads go up, those who haven't lost their jobs. And I think that, you know, that just the pressure of what feels like a daily news cycle which is not just growing, but which is also full of, I think, really difficult things to report, is having quite an emotional toll on the field of journalism. And in general, newsrooms have not coped very well with that in the past. We haven't thought of good techniques for getting our reporters rotated, of giving them psychological and sort of health support in the same way. But in talking to a number of heads of big newsrooms, even before the pandemic, we asked them what their number one worry was, and their response was all the same, which was burnout. We're really worried about journalists, good journalists, leaving the profession because they are just burning out. So I think that that's something that I would flag as being important. So, you know, what does all of this mean? Just a sort of couple of minutes on what we think the sort of the long-term future trends mean. So, you know, the first thing is, and it's hard to think about this, but like innovation is really important. And some of the most, I think, kind of encouraging things that we're seeing is how particularly small and new newsrooms are thinking about how they innovate. And that's not just about the technology. We used to talk about innovation as a technology problem, but often now it's about thinking about new business models, thinking about ways of working together, thinking about, you know, the audience and how you deliver the right format to the audience. We've seen in the US a couple of, I think, sort of enduring changes to how people work. One of which is we're starting to see the emergence of journalism cooperatives. This is where commercial models have either failed or journalists have left commercial media because they felt that it wasn't really serving the audience and it wasn't helping pay their wages. So just in the past sort of month, there have been three major new cooperatives emerge, one around one called Brickhouse Media, which I'm involved in advising, which is a group of investigative and long-form journalists who have just raised funding, which is great news. The second is a group of journalists who worked at an organization called Deadspin, which was taken over, and they were asked to do their jobs differently and not to write about sport and politics, just to focus on sport. Well, it's impossible to write about sport unless you write about politics. So they formed their own media cooperative. And I think that that's a really interesting model that we haven't seen. We've seen a little bit of experimentation, but we haven't really seen it take off. And that could be, I think, a very exciting thing to look at. The second thing is that, you know, we really need much more intervention when it comes to supporting journalism. And it's easy to say, but hard to do. What this has exposed is that even where governments do have public media funding, it's not very well organized for the kind of event that we've just had. So in other words, it doesn't necessarily get money quickly enough to smaller outlets. And that sort of leads on to the next point, which is, I think, something which has really changed over the pandemic is how hands-on the platforms have become in 2 or 3 different dimensions, one of which is editing and curating. So we've seen much more activity from the platforms in taking down material, in creating their own news tabs, in making calls, which they were very reluctant to do even a year ago. Not just flagging fact checking, but we've seen, you know, we've seen Twitter flag the president's tweets. We've seen networks spreading conspiracy theories taken off Facebook, and all of these things have been, you know, they've been a problem for a long time, but the platforms haven't actually done anything about them. And I think now they've dipped their toes into that, we will just see more of that. I think they will just become much more active in promoting or getting rid of certain types of content. And that has, I think, big implications for journalism. I think that we're still very reliant on the algorithms and the changes in curation practice of all of the big platforms. So that's something where we need more insight into what they're doing and more accountability. We do need better sort of independent support for journalism. At the moment, Facebook and Google are 2 of the main contributors to supporting journalism, and the amounts of money they're giving are very small compared to their overall revenues. So we're watching Australia with great interest, which is an attempt to force those companies to give more to support publishing. There's a very interesting battle, I think, there. I'm sure lots of you are watching it already. If not, and you're interested in this, how the Australian government is handling that, I think, is it's a very interesting potential lesson for the future here. And then I think that, you know, kind of the other thing that we're going to see, which we've been studying at the Tau Centre, and I call this like a return to the 19th century, which sounds a bit alarming, but it's sort of a technological version of that, which is where we are losing advertising from free media. So in other words, you know, if we think that a number of outlets will be healthy because they have support from their readers, so reader revenue model works, but there's still an awful lot of media which has been paid for by advertising, which is potentially going to disappear. When advertising disappears, what we're seeing in the local market is that other means of funding moves into that market to create local news. And when I say create local news, I mean it's usually politically funded, so funded by PAC funding, or it can be commercially funded. Big organizations, local organizations that we see power companies owning papers. This is not new. This is the main model. This was the main model for American news in the 19th century and news everywhere else, which was if you were a partisan, you owned a newspaper. Advertising gave us a different model and created independence in journalism. And what we've seen is where that money goes away, then actually we're reverting to political interests in particular. Maybe it's because it's an election year here, but at the Tau Centre, we've been looking at a local network, which is the fastest growing network of local titles, which is funded by political money. It's very hard to know exactly who is behind it. Nobody quite knows how to deal with these entities because they feel new. It's actually a trend which came from Central Europe, from Estonia, Latvia, etc. We've seen it in Africa, and now it's showing up in America and other places as well. So that's, I think, a sort of a really kind of interesting and difficult to control trend, but it does mean that we need more intervention. And then ultimately the shape of the industry, and then I'll stop and we can have a conversation. So what I think we're seeing is this consolidation that I talked about. We are going to be left with a very small number of bigger players, like much bigger players. The New York Times is the biggest it's ever been. I think that, you know, the big sort of broadcasters, the ones that are left, will have larger newsrooms than ever before. But there will be very, very few of them. And I would include Facebook and Google, and who knows, maybe one or two other platforms, Apple perhaps, in that group of really large players that control a lot of the news output, either through distribution and monetization or because they're creating it. And at the other end of the scale, I think we will see a much larger number of really small single person or small newsroom operations, newsletters, podcasts, personalization of media. So we see platforms like Substack, Medium growing, and that real kind of journalists leaving the newsroom to set up their own newsletter businesses to address these narrow audiences. So that's a kind of, I think that that's the shape of it. My worry about that is that in a very fragmented industry, you lose some of the strength you need, institutional strength, to make sure your local politicians are behaving themselves and to make sure that your national organizations are behaving themselves. And I think that that power to account is being made up for by these networks like the ICFJ, the OCCRP, you know, these new types of organization, you know, even the Committee to Protect Journalists, that people had barely heard about, like maybe kind of 5 years ago and 10 years ago didn't really exist, some of these places. I think they're now going to become much more central to how we think about organising accountability journalism. So I'm going to stop there because that feels like quite a lot. So Paula, I don't know if you have any
Yes.
questions. If anyone else has questions, please fire them at me. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer them, but I'll have a go.
Thank you so much, Emily. This is really being like a, a very important class on journalism, on future, and on so many things that I will try to keep focus on 5 issues, but it's a lot to digest because it's a very, very comprehensive and profound reflection and on our profession. So you have, as you have said and written, the effects of COVID-19 are already being framed as an extinction event. And hearing you, what you said, seems to me that in this extinction event, who is going to survive and who are going to be the dinosaurs? We hopefully a lot of media will survive and a lot of journalists will survive. But seems to me that only the ones that have developed and have been able to sell subscriptions are going to survive, right? Is it the case? And that's one question. Right. And the other, I mean, only the people that has managed to make the audience pay for content are going to survive, and the ones that have not been able to do so, no, because the trends on decline of advertising are so dramatic. And the second question to you about the same issue is, to which extent this extinction event is going to perform? I mean, do you think that this very so far weak media system we have in the moment before COVID, with all the economic problems, with all the digital challenges, was very, very weak, the system? But with COVID, I mean, to which extent do you think half of the media that so far has survived is going to go extinct? Right. It's going to be 70%. I know you don't want to be like, to see the future, but yeah. What do we have to prepare us for?
I think that's a great question, Paula. So I'm going to take that bit of it first and address it, which is, since we started tracking the job cuts in US newsrooms, everybody wants us to put a figure on how many jobs are lost. And we see estimates of maybe 30, 40,000, which means about a 50% cut in where we are at the moment. But it's one of the things that has emerged from this is it is really hard to evaluate exactly how many people we're talking about and what we think of media as being at the moment, because, we don't even really count, do we count something like somebody who runs a local newsletter and is on a Facebook group, or, the platform called Nextdoor? Do we count them as a news reporter? If we're looking at traditional newsrooms and the number of professional reporters with all of their benefits and salaries paid, I don't think there's any doubt that this is going to be really catastrophic. I think that we do think, we know that something like 10% of our respondents, when we were talking to the ICFJ sample, which is our biggest sample, so 10% at the beginning of the pandemic, right at the beginning of the pandemic, they had either lost their jobs or their jobs were under immediate threat. So if it's 10%, then you can figure that by like maybe September, December, that will be 20%. That's a big loss. So I think we are looking at a decline in line with those revenue losses, and that would be sort of 20-30%. But my worry is that there is, just going back to this last point, there are several big networks now in the US which don't employ very many people, but some employ real reporters, like State's Newsroom. And in fact, we're having a Town Center event discussing this tomorrow, which are paid for by political interests. So, kind of the replacement of some of those jobs will come from places that we do not associate with funding independent journalists. So when you say, well, it's all going to be subscription, yes, a lot of it is going to be subscription. That's very bad news for large parts of the population, because they don't have the money to pay new subscriptions, and they have more urgent priorities. So at the local level, I think we have to hope that a mix of third-party support, whether it's local philanthropy or big organizations that decide journalism is a priority, or a forced taxation on the platforms, will help keep free media alive, particularly in local markets. I think that that's the thing, which is, and if you don't, we've seen what happens. I've been doing a bit of a study on what happens when your local hometown paper closes down. Margaret Sullivan, my colleague at the Washington Post, has written a great book on disappearance of local news. And, you know, it really is very hard to find out fundamental information. Like in the pandemic, how many people died at your local nursing home is actually really difficult to find out if you don't have a local newspaper covering it. So I think you're right, which is the survivors will be the ones who have rich audiences, who can connect with those audiences, and who can get people to pay for news. And I think people are more motivated to pay for news now, which is great. Does that scale to the amount of reporting we need? No. And that's the big question mark. That's where we have to find other people and other sources to create new types of reporting on the ground. Because the other trend, you know, we have artificial intelligence. We already have the capacity to template and create automatic news stories. So we're looking at this political network called Metric Media, which is now buying local newspapers as well as creating them. It publishes like 450,000, it's published 450,000 stories in a 3-month period. The vast majority of those are automated from other information sources. So this is a very long answer to your question, but I think it's a really important question. It's a really important question, because we have to choose now whether we want our local news ecosystem and even our national news ecosystem to be these scam or political or disinformation networks, or whether we want to really have accountability reporting, people doing the reporting at local, at ground level. Because that is the extinction event. I think that is the real problem.
Exactly. And as you were saying, the other trends, which is really, really interesting, is that going back to 19th century model of press, which was, of course, to disseminate political ideas. And then you say, well, this advertising revenue that is leaving us is not going to come back. But then you have these politically motivated groups that are going to put money, but I mean, to corrupt journalism, if I may say that, right? So this is, as someone Marilyn is putting in the chat, is like a disaster for serious journalism, because we're going to face a threat that this money is going to come back in these guys. Okay, I'm going to put money, whether it is commercially motivated because they want native advertising, you know, related to their own commercial interests, or worse than that, even worse than that, politically motivated. So my question now would be for you, what do journalists, I mean, besides media companies, what we can do in order to continue maintaining the integrity and the independence that is basic for this profession? Because it seems to me also that if there's going to be very few big players like media companies that have the power and the money to, you know, have journalists that can make a living there, and they can be independent. And then you have all the other landscape of a lot of, you know, one-man show media, one-woman show media. Then we have to prepare ourselves to go which way? What would you advise? And this is my question to young journalists, to middle career journalists, and to senior ones.
So, you know, I think that there are two things to prepare ourselves. One of which is just that at ground level, so at reporting level, we have to build a different relationship with the audience. We have to make a strong case as to why independent reporting, even if it doesn't get things right all the time, has to be, we have to reestablish ourselves and that relationship with audiences. And that means explaining much more about the immediate ecosystem to them. So why are they seeing these crazy stories in their neighborhood? Why are the riots in their cities, say like Portland or wherever, being transmitted in a certain way? And where do they go to for news that they can rely on, and also where they have accountability? So I think this is where we need to say you have to have, every community deserves reporting. But we've seen in our research that lots of communities have given up on journalism because they feel reporting is done to them. They don't think it's done for them. They don't appreciate and have no reason to appreciate what journalism does in their community. So we know from studies that if you don't have a local newspaper, then you're an independent local newspaper, then public officials stay in post for longer, their salaries are higher, you have a higher level of corruption at local level, you have really big disasters like Flint, Michigan, big town had its water sources poisoned. And that was at a point where their local coverage was very, very thin, and a group of volunteers came together to really work on that story. And that's the second thing. So the first thing is this: how do we talk to and think about having that relationship with the audience? And we see lots of innovation around that. So I was talking to a young woman last week who runs a news, she calls it, doesn't even call it a newsroom or a newspaper, it's called a news, news organization, but it's collaborative in the South. She's talking to Black audiences that have felt very disconnected from mainstream media. One of the things they do is they just hold regular events, so like literally town halls where people come and see them and they can see they're represented, they can ask questions about stories, they can have a kind of connection. So that's one thing. And then the second thing I think is how we work with each other. So as the field shrinks, this competition we've seen between commercial media goes away somewhat. And our ability to form collectives, or at least to be able to recognize similar journalists of quality, becomes a way of creating those networks of strength. And we see some really, kind of interesting things happening there. So 10 years ago, 11 years ago, well, 15 years ago, you had no really big non-profit news organizations in the US apart from maybe public media. There was none, not one. Now you have, kind of dozens and dozens, but you also have organizations like ProPublica, which is a investigative unit, very like your own kind of investigative units in Chile. And what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is that they have started to work not just on national stories, but with local reporting organizations. And I think that is crucial. So if you see journalism disappearing in your area, then talking to other newsrooms or other individual journalists, finding ways that you can work together, finding ways that you can provide protection for each other or centralized services is the future. And I think if you have a good faith government with money to spend on public media, that's the conversation to be having, instead of just maybe funding 1 or 2 really big institutions like the BBC. You need to be thinking, how can we fund that kind of activity at ground level? And government should be thinking about how to get funding from the platforms into those networks. The problem is that there are a decreasing number of trustworthy governments who have any interest in maintaining independent media at all. So, we see it everywhere. Journalism, free journalism is in recession everywhere. And you look at really horrifying examples like Hungary, Belarus. This has happened in a really relatively short space of time. And so, then the question is, globally, how can we also create these networks that protect and help journalists get their stories out in these difficult places everywhere, as I say, from China, Belarus, etc., Brazil, you know, kind of this is happening everywhere to some extent in the US as well. So I think that those two things are crucial, how we work with each other and how we work with the audience.
And Emily, seems to me, listening to you, that in order to create this, you know, journalists, to create this, you know, a critical mass of journalists in Chile, in this case, or in the US, that really want to work collaboratively and to, you know, to be committed to high quality journalism. Is it important that for young journalists, for the people we are, you know, working with at universities, at Columbia, at Universidad de Portales, we try to create in them, or to inspire them to be more entrepreneurial, in the sense of being their own brand? Right. You know, like, you know, not to, before it was the case that, okay, you make them be prepared to work for a big media company, but now seems to me, I don't know what's your opinion, that we have to, you know, make them resilient enough to build their own brand and to be able to do their own journalism, whether they are, you know, hired in a big company or not. Right. What do you think about that? Yeah.
I think that's completely right. I think that it feels like we're putting an unreasonable level of expectation on young journalists, because it's a lot to report difficult stories and to organize yourself and have your own brand, and not to have institutional support, not to have legal support, not to have all that. But I think that this is absolutely right in terms of how we need to train our journalists, and we do some of this at Columbia already. I think that we have different students now coming into journalism schools who understand two things, one of which is they have to be more entrepreneurial, and, you know, the future, you were saying, well, the future is like subscription, but the future might be a subscription to like one newsletter. So are you going to be the person that delivers that newsletter to your audience? And we have to prepare young journalists to do that, but also we have to change ourselves to be supportive networks, not just, you know, asking people for donations every year, but actually providing some network support, thinking how we can take educational institutions and make them part of this, because we're all in a knowledge economy where this really matters. What services we can provide. So interestingly, at Columbia in New York, we now have the Knight First Amendment Institute, which is, it's not exactly a legal clinic, but it provides services and test cases and scholarship into supporting First Amendment rights in all kinds of different new challenges that we're seeing through electronic media. And that's something that would not have existed at a university a few years ago. And with the journalism school, you know, this idea of lifelong learning and how we can keep a value for our graduates in their networking. You know, I was just saying before we had the Zoom call that I had a class last year we just have a Slack channel that discusses the stuff, and everybody who left and they've all got jobs or internships somewhere else, we're all still talking to each other about, you know, disinformation and how the internet's being used, and we're highlighting and we're giving each other advice. I think that's got to become part of what we do as well. So I think that you need robust institutions like universities to think, how can we participate in this part of the knowledge economy? And we have to train our students to think, to not expect a 20-year career in one place. What cheers me up is that when I see students coming in now, they are very committed, very entrepreneurial. They often see their careers as, I don't think I maybe will do this forever, but there are some stories that I really want to tell, and this is what I'm going to do. So I think that that's really positive.
Yeah, more motivated about the goals than having like this long-term, you know, contract with a big media. Francisca Skownik, which is the boss here at our journalism school, she's asking the same thing. How should schools of journalism adapt to equip our students with the tools to survive this new environment? And specifically, what kind of different courses, different, skills specifically we have to develop as teachers, as professors with our students?
I mean, one course that we started last year, which was so the Tao Center, we do, one of the things we think about are what types of new courses should we introduce. Part of our remit is how do we change the pedagogy at the school. And when I arrived 10 years ago, one of the things that was missing from the curriculum was an understanding of data and computation. And now we have really one of the best. We have a data degree, we have computational journalism degree. The first computational journalists we graduated, people were like, I don't know where they're going to work. I think you're overtraining them. And now the graduates in that program are in such high demand that, they go instantly. If they don't, sadly, if they don't go to Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they go to Facebook and Google, because everybody wants somebody who can understand both the actual technical underpinnings of this and have a sense of the impact of news. A data degree has been, so the next wave of that, I think, is yes, teaching, I think, resilience and understanding of how to be a sole operative, how to manage your career in a slightly different way. We have to adjust in that way. And I was teaching a class last year called Information Warfare Reporting, which was really about, so we teach journalists to report in physically hostile environments, being shot at, being in a war zone, etc. We need to teach journalists how to report where the information environment is really hostile. And we've seen that this year in America in a big way with COVID and with the election, with conspiracy theories like QAnon. And I think that beginning to move into real life, beginning to affect elected officials. We have candidates standing now for the Senate in the US who believe in crazy conspiracy theories, and they put that as part of their sell to the electorate. How do you report that? One of which is just understanding how to find out where information comes from that other people are encountering. And the second thing is like how to talk to audiences about that and how to counter it. So we had great fun in my class finding out like how all these groups were using Instagram, how they were using Facebook closed groups. We teach how to extract data from closed groups where people are talking about and seeding conspiracy theories or pieces of news that favor them. Understanding like how advertising technology works, because everything that underpins this is marketing technology. And we didn't think as reporters, why would, if you're doing, if you're doing like a business course, you need to understand that. You need to understand it now if you're doing finance, if you're doing health, if you're doing government, if you're doing elections. We had an app. There was a primary election in Iowa this year, which had a big screw up with an election app. The number of reporters who could actually tell you why the technology was flawed, almost none. So that's the next wave. We have to understand that this environment is changing everything, and particularly the things that we report on. And we see it in finance. So, this big story about banks, etc. When 2008 happened, there were a tiny number of people who understood really what the banking system, involved, like what algorithms were involved, how real-time trading works. And the consequences of not really understanding that, both in the banks and in the media, was huge. And I think we have the same thing now with information. So that would be that's my feeling, which is we have to think about what is the place of the journalist and learn techniques for countering, like good information design. What's really fascinating about the coronavirus coverage is my students were really good at detecting fake accounts, really good at understanding how everything from Facebook through to Amazon reviews are being used to, affect people's behavior. They understood propaganda and propagandistic techniques from government. The question, what do we do about it? What effective techniques are there? Is not well understood at all. So actually repetition, good information design, making yourself available to answer questions from your community, going and correcting people. These are all tedious things that journalists did not expect to have to do. They thought, I just put my story out there, everybody will see it, everybody will know it's the right one. It's not the case anymore. So we have to kind of think about how we advocate for our own work in that environment. Those are my thoughts on that.
And Emily, one of the trends or the new things that might stay is remote reporting, right? Because as we were discussing before, even though when we have accessibility to the vaccine, I mean, maybe at the end of next year, we're going to see something like life as was before, if we have that chance. So what are the limitations to remote reporting and to not go to the ground,
right,
in the sense that I mean, with all the digital tools and with all the data tools that we can use for reporting, there's something that is very, very connected to the deep roots of this profession that is going to the ground, going to talk to people and to see things. Without that, what can be done to acknowledge that and also to compensate that lack of access? And on the other hand, what you were saying about, for example, asking sources to report for us or to showing us or to tape, what are the conflicts with the relationship with the source? Because I mean, you're like working with them. I mean, how can you be sure you're not going to be manipulated by them?
Right. So I think those are great questions. I mean, the first thing to say is that by far and away, the most important thing is to go there yourself. It's like nothing is a substitute for actually being in an environment and understanding the geography and understanding the kind of actions. And actually one of the parts of remote reporting is having a physical understanding of what you're reporting on. So in other words, I think when reporters now feel that they are going to be remote, nevertheless, you need to go there, even if you can't go there the moment you report. What does your local hospital look like? We did some research in New York media at the beginning of this year. The one finding which was fascinating is that there were no metro hospital reporters in New York at the beginning of the pandemic. Like there were school reporters, but so the physicality of the building, how big is it? How many doctors are? Which floor are they on? How do they communicate? Preparation for remote reporting has to be taking the opportunity to go to these places and understand how people communicate there. What do these places look like? Does it seem, it's like Portland. My son is at college in Portland, and it's been a huge story here about the riots. The riots in Portland take place in a tiny, tiny area. And when you look at the map, if you've been there, you can understand it. And you can understand how this is done. If you haven't been there, then you are completely in the hands of scammers and grifters and people pretending to be the press when they say, look at this, like this is in flames, these cities are in flames. So I think that, we cannot give up on one of the special skills of journalists will still be getting physical access to people, to places. The second one is the remote version, which is learn to use open source, what we call OSINT tools, open source intelligence tools, and to know which ones are trustworthy, which can be manipulated, how to check and cross-check. So do you know how to use geolocational tools? Do you know what might be available from places like Planet Labs, which does low Earth orbit satellites and takes pictures, you know, live pictures of the Earth? Do you know how to use mapping technologies to cross-check when somebody says that an explosion has taken place? So we had this in last year with a dispute on the Indian border and sort of bombing operations there. There was a disputed version of what had happened. Reuters took the open source material and were able to kind of prove a particular version of the story, not another one. Places like Bellingcat, which is an investigative unit in the UK, is absolutely brilliant at doing this. The New York Times has a desk now that does it. It's important to know how many tools are available so that you can kind of build that picture and verify it. So, you know, at every point, somebody will be trying to interrupt. Then your second question about how do you work closely, I think is so difficult. You know, when people say to me, journalism is a service, my good friend Jeff Jarvis, who's a very famous professor here, he's like, it's a community service, etc. There is a tension. Like, you are going to be saying things to and about your community that not everybody will like, and that will actually cost some people their jobs or put them in jail. So you have to think, you know, how do you maintain the correct relationship with people that you're asking to report? If you ask a nurse to report for you from inside a ward, have you thought through implications for her privacy or his privacy? Have you thought through whether they are an individual that has an agenda themselves, or like how to, you know, are they fully informed? Are they giving? We've always worked with sources. I mean, the one thing I would say about this is that journalists are really good at figuring out how to protect sources and how to work with sources with enough distance. I think we haven't had enough practice at it in this dimension. And it throws up really big ethical questions every day. You know, we have a new ethics center, which Craig Newmark has created at Columbia. Huge part of this is answering all of those really difficult questions, which are changed just by the nature of the technology that we're using, you know. And so I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think it's something, again, for young journalists. Publishing is easy. Like, anyone can publish. It's really easy. When I was a young journalist a long time ago, publishing, very, very, very hard. For me, decisions about my reporting were easy because I had editors. I had like 5 layers of editing. You couldn't make a mistake. You couldn't make a mistake, you know, kind of, or you could. And if you made a mistake, it was a really big one and you knew about it and somebody would catch it. Now, actually, those judgments are really hard. So again, we have to flip the teaching a little bit and say, publishing is easy, but the thought processes around your sources, your story, how you publish, where it goes to, what you do once it's published is hard, requires lots of judgment and protecting yourself, protecting your sources, protecting the story.
Yeah, and I think we have time for one more question. That would be, what happens to teamwork in journalism? Is going to be extinct also? Because, as you were saying, the future of the newsrooms, you know, seems to, it's not clear that it's going to come back like it was, like a big place with all the journalists and the different kind of editors and you know, people doing fact checking, and it's going to be different. And maybe media are going to have, like you said, like very small places that people come and go. So that, where is going to be taking place the teamwork that journalism requires?
So I think that's a great question. Journalism is a team sport. You know, it's so hard to do effective journalism as an individual. You need all sorts of, you need sense checks. Everybody needs an editor, everybody. But journalists are very social creatures. I think this is one of the reasons that the pandemic has been very hard on the profession, because we're used to seeing like groups, we're used to socializing at work, we're used to outward, you know, extrovert behaviors. And that a lot of that has been taken away. And I think that's one of the reasons that the profession is. So teamwork has to, I actually think, far from being extinct. I think we will find a new era of teamwork, and it will take place slightly differently to how it took place before. So it might take place on Slack channels with groups of professionals, might take place in places like this, where we're all talking to each other, you know, in the morning across borders. I don't have to get on a plane, sadly. I wish I was with you. People don't have to come in. You know, kind of seeing people, I don't know about, you know, other people on this call. Actually, you know, I've really missed travel, and I've really missed seeing and going to and meeting up with different groups of people. But I've slowly found that I'm replacing that as well by actually talking more frequently to maybe people I would see once a month or once a 6 months or once a year online, and us all getting together and saying, let's discuss this. I think one, you know, we used to laugh at journalism conferences and go, you know, kind of like, why does anyone go to a journalism conference? Journalism conferences have become incredibly important for people who can go to them. You know, the Global Investigative Journalism Network conference started 10 years ago with like 190 people. And last year in Hamburg, it was 2,000 people. And I think that's because of that necessity that's been taken out of the newsroom, is moving into these associations, and I think sort of, you know, again, supporting associations and people's ability to join those groups is actually easy. Meeting in person is now hard, but having those affiliations, and I think journalists are much less cynical now about, I don't want to go to that conference, I don't want to join that network, etc. I think we are good. We are really good at replacing some, not all, but some of what's lost in the newsroom with new types of networks, listservs. I'm on a great investigative listserv with people who go to the NICAR conference who are asking each other questions all the time. So different, teamwork is different, but it cannot go away. It's the bedrock of what we do.
That's so great. There's one question here that I want to ask you, but I don't know if we have time. Do we have?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. It's Alfonso Diaz asking his question. Are we better off than 10 years ago? But he says, I mean, basically Latin America, for in the US, where I eat most of my journalism menu, I have my own strong opinions.
Are we better off than what 10 years ago? So economically, no. And I'm a big believer that economics matters. I think that, you know, the things that journalists and newsrooms have gone through in the last 10 years are not desirable. I don't think the threat to press freedom is desirable. I think we're more under attack. I think that there are fewer of us. I think that we don't know so much about. I do think that we are better off in one respect, which is that our dependence on a commercial media model, which has been broken for a long time, is disappearing. And it's hard when people can't get their healthcare paid for to believe that that's a positive. But in the long term, I do think commercialization of media has been a real problem for a long time. Yes, advertising created this new independent model, but we've seen, you know, when you have rampant commercialization, standards, discipline, mission, are all subsumed by money and gain. And a lot of, you know, the harm which has been done to journalism has come internally from organizations that have been very commercially focused or politically focused, and sometimes, like Fox News, focused on both of those things. So the positive, I think, about are we better off is I think people who are committed have a clear vision that we cannot restore what has gone, and we need to create something which is better. It's hard when you don't have money, but at least that vision is clear. And I see it in our students, and I know, talking to you and Andrea and your colleagues, you see it in your students too. You know, this is mission driven, and the opportunity to tell vivid stories now and to be held accountable by your audiences is much greater. And that, I think, is really positive.
And do you think that finally the world is going to have a, I don't know, an understanding of a commitment to pass laws like Australia is doing and some countries in Europe, in the sense that all these, big platforms like Facebook and Google that has taken away all the money from the advertising might pay for the content finally, because this is very important, and because otherwise, I mean, as you were saying, the money they are giving, it's really peanuts for them. I mean, it's not. I mean, and it's like, what some companies do, like social responsibility programs, like
Yeah.
to save the, to wash their image. So if they don't pay for what they have taken away, in the sense of a lot of money, it's going to be tough, because funding from governments, it's really complicated, and funding from philanthropy likewise. So
Yes.
do you think Australia is leading this? I mean, the world is going to, maybe in 10 more years, we're going to have that.
Yeah, so I think that we will see the world divide into countries that have a fair sense and a commitment to providing a public sphere, which is genuinely a public sphere, and countries who don't. And America used to lead the countries that thought you should have a public sphere and defend it. Many European countries after the Second World War made that choice too, and said we will have public media which can be defended, and we've seen that that can either be a real benefit and work for 50 years and be very strong, or it can be co-opted by politics and fail. And I think that we're just at a tipping point where those two models are in competition, and at the moment, the number of countries that want to genuinely create a public sphere and tax or break up the larger platforms who now control the media. We haven't talked about this, but control of the media has completely gone to the technology companies in the past 10 years. That's absolutely not in dispute. And I think that at the moment, that's not a majority model. I don't know that a change of government here will change that. It maybe will do. But the consequences of not engaging with that as a government, I think, has long-term, very sort of serious implications for society. So I don't know. I mean, my worry is that things have to get worse before they get better. And that actually civil society, we need to be working much harder on civil society models. We've worked so hard on commercial models, and that has not really worked. If we had put half the effort we put into figuring out commercial models into civil society models, I think we would be in a much better place right now. But we need to do that work now. So I think it can't be reliant, as you say, on governments. I think it can flow from redistribution of wealth, but we need models where civic ownership, accountability are regarded as seriously as commercial models. And there's a lot of work to do in that respect. We're not at all advanced at thinking about that.
And finally, Emily, well, it's impossible not to ask you about the American election, because it has an enormous impact, not only on the US, because in the whole world. So what are your thoughts about? What are you worried about? I mean, and how do you see it playing so far?
Right. Well, I'm British, so I don't have a vote. I'm still not a citizen here. So I still have an outsider's perspective. But I mean, I think that, the real worry for everybody going into the election, and this was the same in 2016, but less obvious, is the vast social inequalities that now exist in America have not been properly addressed. They haven't addressed civil rights movement. They haven't addressed income inequality. There are all sorts of things which worry me, that because they are not, this has not been tackled. So, I mean, the main worry for everybody who cares, I think, about the future of America is that we end up with a government which is corrupt and unaccountable. And there are strong signs that that has been the case for the past 4 years, because the rule of law is not respected by the Trump administration. Truth is not really respected by the Trump administration. A lot of the things that the Trump administration, for instance, has done about sort of coronavirus has ended up enriching a very small number of people who are friends of the president. I mean, these are not patterns which America likes to acknowledge are happening. So the worst thing that could happen is that we just have a kind of continuation, escalation of that. If you look at the polls, it says that Joe Biden is going to win. You know, nobody really trusts the polls, but if you look at the polls, that's clear. It's close, but he is going to win. If you spend a lot of time, which I've been doing for research, in Facebook groups, or you drive, you know, out of New York City, again, this is physical reporting, go and look at lawn signs, etc., you would think that Trump is going to win by a landslide. And this is a kind of an interesting challenge for journalists, which is there are different realities in the same country, and our ability to sort of navigate and report on that is really challenged. And I think, you know, the American press actually has done a great job in finding really important stories about corruption in the current regime, but they've had very little impact. The way that the coronavirus has been handled here has been catastrophic. It's been absolutely, you know, 200,000 people dead. We're still kind of in economic lockdown. We're going to be that way for a while. The messaging from the top has been terrible. The management of it has only really worked where you've had stronger state governors. It's a disaster. It's an economic disaster. It's a social disaster. It's a kind of personal disaster for many people. And yet it's not having as big an impact as you would expect on the polling results. And I think, you know, as journalists, we have to ask ourselves why. I think the platforms have to ask themselves why. I think, you know, we have to say we need to do a kind of a better job at this. So I don't know. I genuinely do not know what's going to happen. And I think anyone in America at the moment who tells you that they know what's going to happen is lying. I think that the problem is it's too close given the circumstances of the previous 4 years to say that, you know, we've done a great job of accountability. I think that's something that the press here is very self-reflective about at the moment.
Well, we're going to see this story as it develops. And thank you so much, Emily Bell. It's been quite a pleasure and quite a privilege to talk to you today. Everyone is putting here in the chat the same thing. And before ending this session, I want to invite you all for Tuesday, October the 6th, at the same time, 11:30 in Chile, 10:30 in the US. We are having another webinar, this time with Andy Tucker, talking about fake news, history, and evolution, which is something really, really key today in the US, in Chile, everywhere, unfortunately. Thank you so much again, Emily. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much. I hope to see you in person soon. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. We all hope that. Bye.
Okay.